simple subject. This is our alpha motor neuron here. It's also called a lower motor neuron. Alpha motor neuron. The same thing as a lower motor neuron. Same thing as the anterior horn cell. The point I want to make in this slide here is that the alpha motor neuron is the final neuron that goes from the spinal cord to the skeletal muscle. It's the final common pathway. It's the final common pathway. It goes from the ventral horn of the spinal cord out to the skeletal muscle. Okay? Everything else you can consider an upper motor neuron. Everything else is considered an upper motor neuron. You see all of these things over here? We talked about vestibulospinal, we talked about rubrospinal. Tectospinal comes from a place called the tectum, which is a visual pathway. So if I saw a sudden bright flash of light, I jerk my head. It's a reflex pathway to see where the light's coming from. But all of these up here come from higher centers. They're called collectively upper motor neurons. So bottom line, if you have a lesion of the alpha motor neuron, the cell body, or the axon itself, you have a lower motor neuron lesion. If you have stroke, which is going to involve these neurons, you have an upper motor neuron lesion. You get it? You get the point? If you take a gunshot wound to this part of the spinal cord that got hit right here, you're going to destroy the alpha motor neuron. So at that level, you'll have a lower motor neuron lesion. But everything below it, you've cut. That means everything below it would be an upper motor neuron lesion. You got that?
She just got dressed in her cake. That's what happened. It's on the floor. It's on the floor.
Kathy wrote that in? Britain told me just before I came down here, said, you know what? Nancy was going to bring that cake down to the class. I told her, no, you won't bring that cake. That's funny. She was like,
Can you say that one more time? You get the lesion that comes off all the alpha motor.
oh, I thought you did. I think you said that. So if I take a, let me draw it. If this is the spinal cord, and I take a gunshot wound right there, I'm destroying the alpha motor neuron at that level. So the spinal nerve coming out, this would be a lower motor neuron lesion. But the alpha motor neurons below that, I cut the descending pathways to reach them. So these would be an upper motor neuron lesion. So an upper motor neuron lesion would be applied to these, whereas a lower motor neuron lesion would be applied to the alpha motor neurons that got injured directly. Okay? That cleared up?
Yeah.
And the reason we do that is because here we have a reflex arc. Sensory in, some inner neurons, and then motor out. if you have a lower motor neuron lesion, you're going to interrupt the reflex arc, right? You interrupt the reflex arc. If you have an upper motor neuron lesion, the reflex arc is still intact. You just wiped out the inputs to it. I'll say it again. In an upper motor neuron lesion, the reflex arc is still intact. You just wiped out the descending inputs to it. So I ask you this. When I tap your patella, why is it that when I tap your patella, even with hyperreflexive Samantha over there, why is it that she just does that and not? Why is it that she not fire everything in her quadriceps? Why is it that when I walk down that stairs and I miss the step, I just catch myself instead of missing the step and firing? Why is that? Because all of these descending inputs modulate the amount of firing of alpha motor neurons. They allow only a proportionate amount of firing. If more firing needs to happen, these guys modulate it to recruit more alpha motor neurons. If less firing, they shut them down. Here's the point. If I have a lower motor neuron lesion, if I interrupt the reflex arc, what do you think happens to a deep tendon reflex? It becomes hyporeflexive. It doesn't work. You have no motor cells to kick out. What happens if you have an upper motor neuron lesion? You remove the modulation, so when you tap the patella, everything fires. There's nothing to modulate it. In an upper motor neuron lesion, you have hyperreflexia. Does that make sense? Lower motor neuron, you interrupt the reflex arc, hyporeflexia. Upper motor neuron lesion, you take out the modulation, so everything fires, you have hyperreflexia. Can I tell you about the story when I was a student about the hyperreflexia? I didn't tell you a story about that. So you know how in an emergency room they have the curtains, you know, that are on the chain and the track, you know, you pull around a patient. So I was on my rotation when I was a student out in western Kansas, a town called Tribune, 15 miles from Colorado. Didn't have a stop sign, stop light, no nothing. It was in the middle of freaking nowhere. This, the lawyer in town, his wife was cooking dinner one night, and she had her house coat on. And you know those little pink shoes, you slip your feet into the back, the house slippers, you know? She had those house slippers on, and she was cooking dinner when she collapsed. They bring her to the emergency room, which was just a little one room with one bed. Dr. Werner was the guy's name. He was out here and had the curtain drawn around the woman, and I was inside with the woman. And you know, her pupils are fixed and dilated. And, you know, she's had a stroke. She's had a stroke. I'm thinking, hey, let's check out this hyperreflexia thing. So, so if a person is supine to do a deep tendon reflex, you get up underneath their popliteal, their knee, and you tap their patella right here. You understand what I'm talking about? Right. So her head was down there, and the curtain was drawn around her like this, so nobody could see me. So I just kind of picked her leg up like this, and I tapped. So the next thing I remember, that leg came up and hit me so hard in the head, it staggered. And it took me a minute to get my wits about me, and I looked down, and that little pink slipper was gone. And I'm thinking, what happened? Because I gotta find the pink slipper, because they're gonna come in and know I've been jacking with a dying woman. Where's the pink slipper? Now, I can't go looking around because you can see my feet under the curtain. Right? I'm just dying right here. What am I gonna do? What am I gonna do? And so I could not find the pink slipper. So I came outside the curtain, and Dr. Werner was standing there. Remember I said the chain?
Went over the thing.
The pink slipper went through the chain. He was standing there with a pink slipper, and he said, hyper-reflexive. So he knew what I'd done. And I'm like, oh yeah, you know, it was embarrassing. So I go over there, wash my hands, and you know those towel rack, that chrome thing, there you can see yourself. I look up and there's this red in the middle of my head. So that's hyper-reflexive. But if you're going to test it, the point, the take-home point, is don't stand it. It's like doing the triceps. You get hit the noon of it. You're not standing in front of it. Anyway, we kind of got off the subject. All right. One thing before I leave this slide, there are two other things that are shown on this slide that I want you to appreciate, and I'll talk about them later on. If we look at the dorsal column pathway, you see these big fibers coming in? They come in and they ascend in the dorsal column without synapse. That's the dorsal column pathway. If we look at the spinothalamic tract, these come in, they synapse in the substantia gelatinosa. The second order cell crosses the midline in front of the central canal to go to the spinothalamic tract on the other side. So they go up the spinothalamic tract on the opposite side. Yes, ma'am.
Second order cell crosses the midline.
So this slide shows three things I want you to appreciate. One is the arch, the arc. Two is the dorsal column pathway comes in and ascends ipsilateral. Spinothalamic tract comes in, synapses in substantia gelatinosa or lamina 2, crosses in what's called the ventral commissure, ventral white commissure, and will ascend in the spinothalamic tract on the opposite side. Different fiber types, 8 fibers that you see in the dorsal, associated with the dorsal column. They're large. The larger the fiber, the faster the transmission. That's why touch is almost instantaneous. Touch is almost instantaneous. These things have a large myelin sheath around them. Let's go down here to the unmyelinated C fibers. C fibers are tiny, they're much smaller. They carry pain and temperature. These are the spinothalamic fibers. B fibers are myelinated. They're preganglionic. So here's something going way back to anatomy. If we talk about the lateral horn in the thoracic area, the preganglionic comes out, synapses on the postganglionic, it goes into the spinal nerve, right? These things are called the rami communicantes. I said that this one is white and that one is gray. White because it's myelinated, because it contains B fibers. Here's a couple of micrographs of these things. I'll go into this in more detail tomorrow when we do neuropathophysiology. This is a myelinated fiber. You see the big thickened wrap of myelin. These are unmyelinated fibers. They're much smaller, C fibers, and they're wrapped with just one layer of myelin. These things are wrapped with concentric layers. In this light micrograph up here, you see oodles of myelinated fibers. Between those myelinated fibers, you would see the small unmyelinated ones. They're all mixed in together there. This is a scanning electron micrograph, kind of cool, showing the myelin, showing the axon with its myelin wrap. I thought it was just kind of cool how it showed that nice bundle. Sensory endings for sensory fibers in the periphery. There are all types of endings. Pacinium corpuscles, they're very sensitive to vibration and touch. Ruffini nerve endings, also vibration. I don't care that you know these endings. Professor Polk may go into them, but as far as I'm concerned, in neuroanatomy, you don't need to appreciate them. The other thing I want you to appreciate is these endings, these specialized endings, are usually connected to an A fiber, which is usually dorsal column. The free nerve endings here are the C fibers. They are never encapsulated. Their pain temperature is spinal thalamic tract. This slide and the next one are to illustrate a point. And that is, when we talk about the dermatomes, C4, C5, T1 like that, and we show them as distinct lines, that's complete BS. There's not a complete line. There's overlap between the dermatomes, considerable overlap, probably as much as 1 or 2 segments. So if I say this is T4, it's not really T4, it's probably T3 to T5. It's not a precise line. And this is why. When you have a dorsal root ganglion cell entering the cord, you see here that it's going to synapse in the dorsal horn at different levels. It's not one level. It goes in, it synapses that level, but it goes up. It sends a collateral up, and synapses there, sends another collateral down. Synapses there. It spreads the impulse around. The other thing is this fasciculus proprius. Remember I said the fasciculus proprius was around the gray matter? It does the same thing. You get inputs into there, it connects to different spinal cord levels. Lamina 1 does the same thing. So when you get to appreciating dermatomes, there's overlap out here periphery, and there's overlap centrally. So when you go looking at a spinal cord injury at, say, L3, you're not going to find this area is anesthetic. It's going to be much more diffuse. That's the point I'm going to make. All right, so let's look at the tracks, the 3 tracks that we're going to be testing. Spinocerebellar tract right here we're going to dispense with because it's basically concerned with proprioception. Or not proprioception. Essentially you're letting your cerebellum know where things are so that the movement is fluid. We'll just leave it at that right now. The three tracts that we're going to test clinically are the spinothalamic, dorsal column, and corticospinal. There's a general scheme here for the sensory tracts. The primary afferent, that's the first order neuron. In other words, that's the neuron that starts in the skin or the joint, because it's in the joint capsule. That's where you have proprioception, because the joint capsule knows how much that joint is bent, right? It's still dorsal column, just comes from a different place in the skin, where you would pick up vibration, touch, and all that. That information goes to the spinal cord. It's called first order. Similarly, pain and temperature in the skin goes to the spinal cord. The sensory cell body, is like you've already said, is in the DRG. The first order sensory neuron is always in the dorsal root ganglion. The primary afferent axons will synapse on the second order neuron on the same side in which they entered. If we look at the spinothalamic pathway, well, I'll go back and show it here. If we look at the spinothalamic pathway, the first order neuron synapsed on the second order neuron on the same side at which it entered. The same holds true for the dorsal column. It's just going to synapse not in the spinal cord, but up in the brainstem. I'll cover that in just a second. But it's on the same side. It's the second order neuron that crosses to the other side. Doesn't matter if you're talking about spinothalamic or dorsal column. It's the second order neuron that crosses to the other side. Secondary afferent neurons project to the contralateral VPL. The second order neurons, the cell body is on the same side, they cross to the other side, they're going to ascend to the VPL of the thalamus, ventral-posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus. The VPL contains the third order neuron that will take the information to the cortex, to the sensory cortex. The primary sensory cortex is Brodmann's area 312. This is what it looks like. Spinothalamic, second order, crosses, ascends in the spinothalamic tract up to the VPL nucleus of the thalamus, and from there it goes to the cortex. Dorsal column comes in, goes up to a nucleus in the medulla. I'll cover it in just a second. In the medulla, it's going to cross to the other side and go up to the thalamus, and from there to the sensory cortex. This is the schematic here. This is the spinothalamic pathway. If you go down here to the lower limb, or upper limb, doesn't matter. The first order information comes in, like if I stub my big toe on the right, no, let's say on the left, that pain information came up through my sciatic nerve into my lumbosacral cord, where it synapsed on this side, the left side, and crossed over to the right side and ascended all the way up through the lateral spinothalamic tract to the VPL nucleus of the thalamus. And from there, it went to my primary sensory cortex area 312. If we look at the dorsal column pathway, you touch my toe, it came in, stayed on the same side all the way up to the medulla. And in the medulla, you see there are two nuclei right there. One's called the nucleus gracilis, one's called the nucleus cuneatus. Real hard. That's where they synapsed. Remember, it's the second order that crosses the midline and ascends in a structure called the the medial lemniscus. So touch comes in, stays on the same side, synapses in the medulla, second order crosses, ascends in the medial lemniscus to the VPL nucleus of the thalamus, third order goes to the sensory cortex, area 312. Ani, you just look like you gave birth. You would say that again? All right. So, I touched Andrew's left hand. That sensory information, because this is touch, right? That sensory information came in to his dorsal column on that side, the same side. It went up to his medulla. Since it's his hand, is it gracilis or cuneatus? It's cuneatus. It went up to the nucleus cuneatus, crossed in the medulla, and ascended as the medial lemniscus to his VPL nucleus of the thalamus, and from there it went out to his sensory cortex. That's how it works. The difference here is where they cross. The spinothalamic tract crosses in the core. The dorsal column crosses in the medulla of the brainstem. It's the only difference. If we look at the brain, there's a sulcus that runs right down through the middle here. In front of it is called the precentral gyrus, or the primary motor strip, or motor cortex. Behind that central sulcus is area 314, the primary sensory strip. Your body is represented on that sensory strip, and it looks like that. That's the postcentral gyrus, area 314. This thing is called an homunculus. You are disproportionately represented in terms of the cortex that you dedicate to a sensation. What do you think has the highest dedicated space? Your hands and your face. So if I touch Andrew's hand right here, his left hand, I can tell you that I just activated the neurons right here in the postcentral gyrus on his opposite side. And it doesn't matter if it's touch or ping, it all goes to the same place. So if he has a stroke right there, what artery supplies right there? The middle cerebral. If he has a stroke of the middle cerebral artery, what is he going to lose? He's going to lose the function of his hand. He's not going to lose the function of his toes or his penis. It's right there. How would he lose the function of his toes if he had a stroke of the anterior cerebral artery? Remember, the anterior cerebral artery runs right here. So if you stroke that, you're going to lose function of the lower extremity. If you have a middle cerebral artery stroke, it's going to be, out here, it's going to be the hands and the face. When I said earlier, you can look at a person and say where the lesion is, there you go. This is the sensory homunculus. The motor homunculus is in front of it. The primary motor strip is in front of it. You are represented on the motor strip just like you are on the sensory strip. Again, your lower extremity is in the midline, your hands and your face are out here. This is supposed to represent your larynx, right there, your speech center. I don't know how they get that out of, it looks like a cross between a pickle and a banana, but anyway. So what we're talking about here is the corticospinal tract. This is area 4. Rodman's area 4 is the motor area. Rodman's area 3, 1, 2 is the sensory area. I don't know why they don't call it area 1, 2, 3. They just don't. This is the corticospinal tract. It leaves the cortex according to the homunculus. If I want to move my right hand, my left precentral gyrus starts firing that's dedicated to my hand. It's going to send those impulses down through the brainstem into the medulla, where they cross in the midline at what's called the pyramidal decussation. Decussation is a term that means crossing. Why do you call this pyramidal? Because the cortical neurons that are up here in area 4, they're shaped like a pyramid. They're shaped like a pyramid. So this is called the pyramidal system. They cross at the pyramidal decussation and they descend in the medulla as the pyramids. They enter the corticospinal tract, the lateral corticospinal tract, go all the way down to the synapse on the alpha motor neurons, or mostly interneurons, at the cord levels you're interested in. If I'm driving my left hand, information starts here, and the precentral gyrus goes down, crosses, goes down my cervical cord to C5 through T1, synapses on those alpha motor neurons, and I can do that. If I have a stroke, that's an upper motor neuron lesion, I cannot do that. If I have a lower motor neuron lesion, I can't do that either. Right? Okay? Another thing about upper versus lower motor neuron lesions, hyperreflexia versus hyporeflexia, is that alpha motor neurons give to the muscle cells growth factors. If you remove those growth factors, the muscle cells will wither away, they'll atrophy to nothing. So in a lower motor neuron lesion, you have significant muscle atrophy, and it's flaccid because the motor, there's no motor innervation at all. Upper motor neuron lesions, you still have the alpha motor neuron intact. The growth factors are still there. You have some atrophy, but it's from disuse because you're paralyzed from the stroke up here. It's disuse atrophy. It's not a muscle wasting atrophy. And because the reflex arc is still intact, they can develop fasciculations, contractures, or fasciculations or contractures. because the reflex arc is still intact, when it says spastic paralysis, you see people who are they're called antalgic gaits, A-N-T-A-L-G-I-C. It's a difficult gait. They're, like this. They're very, that's a spastic type of gait. The reflex arc is still intact. You just have damage to the descending inputs. I talked about some of these other inputs. The tectospinal, I talked about the visual reflex. The one I want to talk about here, the other ones I want to mention here, are these right here, the rubrospinal, vestibulospinal, and reticulospinal. And the reason I want to tell you about these descending inputs is because they're at different levels of the brainstem. The rubrospinal, the red nucleus is at the mesencephalon, which is at the highest level. The vestibulospinal is down in the medulla, and the reticulospinal is in the pons. Now some of those have facilitate alpha motor neurons, some of them inhibit alpha motor neurons. Depending where on the brainstem the lesion is, if you facilitate alpha motor neurons, you're going to, and if they go to flexors, you're going to flex if you're unconscious. If they go to extensors, you're going to extend. If you remove inhibition to one or the other, you're going to flex or extend. You can either facilitate or remove inhibition, one of the two. Anyway, you wind up doing what's called posturing with brainstem level lesions. And it has to do with the rubrospinal, vestibulospinal, and reticulospinal tracts. This, where you have flexion of the upper extremities, is called decorticate posturing. Here, where you have extension of the upper extremities, it's called decerebrate posturing. The two take-home messages here is that we're dealing with cutting off descending input to these motor cells. So they're unchecked. You either flex or extend. And this person's unconscious. They've had a stroke or a tumor of the brainstem. That's one point. The other point is that when you're posturing, and it's not due to a drug overdose of some type, if it's due to a lesion, you're probably not going to come back. When you get to the level of posturing and it's due to a neural lesion, you're probably not coming back. If it's due to a metabolic problem or to a drug overdose of some type, you might be able to come back. But if it's due to a nerve lesion itself, you're not going to come back. Decerebrate or decorticate. And you need to remember that decorticate is flexion, decerebrate is extension. Lesions of the spinal cord, a couple of them I want to talk about here. We're almost done, hang in there. There's a condition, there's a disease called syringomyelia. Syringomyelia is a weird disease. It's caused when the central canal starts expanding at different parts of the nerve of the spinal cord. It starts expanding, and as it expands, it pushes on the surrounding tissues and will damage them. Nerves don't like pressure. The first thing that they push on in syringomyelia are the crossing fibers of the spinothalamic tract. So if a person came in with syringomyelia involving C5 and T1 spinal cord segments, they're not going to have any sensation of pain or temperature in the upper extremities. Because you're going to get both crossing from both sides, right? anesthetic in the upper, as far as pain and temperature, in the upper extremities. If it gets larger, you start involving those neurons that are proximal in the ventral horns. I said those were trunk neurons, right? Early on. Your limbs are out here. These are trunk neurons. You're going to have all sorts of weakness in your ability to stand. Syringomyelia, I've seen one case of that in a medical student, and it was pretty significant. Okay. And it usually is spotty. It'll develop here, and then develop down here, and then up here, and so it's a migratory type of disease. Tertiary syphilis will wipe out the dorsal columns. That's Tabes dorsalis. I've mentioned that to you now 8,000 times. These people have lost proprioception and touch. So when they walk, they actually have to look at where their feet are in space because they can no longer tell where they are. And they can't plant their foot normally. They have to slap it down. So Tabes dorsalis is a walk like that, where they're looking at where their feet are going. Tabes dorsalis. This one right here just says damage to the anterior lateral system. Don't worry about that. We'll view that in the context of this. This is, if you understand this, you understand the three tracks of the spinal cord. This is a almost hypothetical situation. I have seen it before, but it's more of a way to teach this. It's called the Brown-Séquard syndrome. What the Brown-Séquard syndrome is a hemisection of the spinal cord. A perfect hemisection of a section of the spinal cord. So we started talking about it over there. So this is a gunshot or a stab wound that cut half the cord at one segment. What are the deficits? Well, they're listed over here, but let's walk through them. So if this is, we'll say this is T6. You understand that at T6, you're going to wipe out all the dorsal root input. So we'll say this is the right side, and that's the left side. So you're going to wipe out all the sensory input from the right side at T6. So T6 on the right will be anesthetic. You can't feel pain, you can't feel touch. What happens below T6 on the right side? If we talk about the spinothalamic tract, well, let's look at T6 on the left side. What happens here? The dorsal column came in and went up, right? The spinothalamic tract went in, synapsed, and crossed, and got cut. So on the left side, at T6, you're going to have no pain and temperature. But you will have touch. As a matter of fact, you can go on down the nervous system. What happens down here at T10? The dorsal column comes in, stays on the same side. The spinothalamic tract comes in, crosses, and tries to go up to the other side, and is cut. So you wind up with, on the left side, at T6 and below, no pain temperature. What happens to the dorsal columns? The dorsal columns on this side, it's again right and left, the dorsal columns on this side, nothing, because they all stayed on the same side, right? Nothing happened to them here. But beginning here and below, they all got whacked. So what it is if the lesion occurs here on the right T6, you can't feel touch on this side, the right side, but you can't feel pain on the left side. What happens to motor function? Motor function, lower motor neuron lesion there. Nothing happens on this side because where did the crossing occur? The pyramidal decussation was up here. But everything below here got cut. So this is an upper motor neuron from here down. So this is hyporeflexic, this is hyperreflexic. Okay? I think that should be all for today. Thank you guys for coming. Thank you for playing. I'll see you tomorrow.